First off, thank y'all for coming. I know that it is right after lunch on the last day of the conference, so you all had the opportunity to go play hooky really easily and just go on the beach, and you didn't. You decided to come hang out with me, so thank y'all. Today we are going to be talking about how to harness the power of Docker from your IDE, even if you don't know anything about Docker. And really, I should probably update the subtitle too, especially if you don't know anything about Docker, because this is not a Docker presentation. This is going to be talking about the cool things that containers let you do and how you can harness that without ever leaving your IDE, which in this case is going to be VS Code, as you can see from my shirt. All right, so quick agenda. We're going to go over who I am and what I do. We'll do a quick containers overview for those of y'all who maybe haven't worked with containers before. And then we'll talk a little bit about what dev containers are and do a demo in VS Code with them. And then we'll also transition over to GitHub code spaces. So we'll do a demo there. And then finish things off with what's called the dev container CLI, which is kind of the future of where we see dev containers coming. So there should be plenty of time for questions at the end, but I definitely want this to be interactive. So throughout this, if y'all have a question, just raise your hand, shout it out. I don't care. Just let me know what your questions are and we can answer those as we go. All right, so first up, who am I? My name is Olivia Guzzardo. I'm a developer advocate at Microsoft. I am from that city up there in the corner. So if y'all don't recognize it, that's Rainbow Row in Charleston, South Carolina. So I just took a few hours down the coast to come here and hang out with y'all. And I've been at Microsoft for about 5 years now. I started out as a .NET consultant. First, I was in the private sector, so I did a lot of Xamarin development. I worked with some of the bigger food and beverage companies for there. And then I ended up transitioning over into the federal space. So I worked in public sector with some of our Microsoft federal customers. Did lots of things there, things like web form development, SharePoint development, CRM development. It was the government, so some things not quite so trending in tech, but still important nonetheless. And then I switched over to the advocate side about 6 months ago. And specifically, I'm an advocate on the VS Code team. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means and why I'm here in front of y'all today. So this is a shameless plug for our social media channels because really the whole point of the developer advocate role is to bridge the gap between the developer community and the VS Code team in this instance, since I'm the VS Code advocate. So one of the ways that we do that is through social media. So we're pretty active on Twitter. On TikTok, we post a few shorts every week. Sometimes they're funny, or we try to be funny, and they're just memes. Sometimes they're specific, hey, did you know you could do this in VS Code? And sometimes they're just technology related in general. They're not even VS Code specific. And then we cross-post those to our YouTube channel, so you can see those shorts there. But then our YouTube channel also has a lot of long-form videos. So we do things with anything in VS Code. We just finished up a data science in VS Code series talking about Jupyter Notebooks. We have videos about Git in VS Code. And then we also do weekly live streams there. So every Thursday, we do a live stream. The first month is generally a release party. So if y'all aren't familiar with VS Code, we actually do monthly releases there. So the first live stream of the month, we do that release party. We have the engineers come on and chat with y'all, show you the cool features we're doing. And then the other live streams for the rest of the month are just cool things in the VS Code community. So a lot of times we'll have extension authors come on. We'll have partners who have different extensions in VS Code. We'll have people internal to Microsoft come on and talk about what they're doing. So for example, a couple of weeks ago, we had some people from the Azure team come on and talk about the Azure extensions. So definitely check us out there. We actually have one going on tomorrow. I'm going to be hosting it, and we have someone from Stripe coming on to talk about their VS Code extension. So it's at 11 a.m. every Thursday Eastern time. So check it out if you want to. Okay, so one other quick thing that I do is things like this, right? I come to these conferences and I ask y'all, who's using VS Code? So who here uses VS Code? Nice. Okay, that's what I like to see. There we go. All right, so just from talking to y'all, I know some of the languages are JavaScript, C#, F#. Are there any other languages y'all are using in VS Code? Shout them out.
Python.
Python, yes, love Python. Node, PowerShell. Okay, cool. All right, so a few. For those of y'all who didn't raise your hand, shout out what editors you are using. I won't be offended. What is that?
WebStorm intelligence.
WebStorm, nice, okay. Vim, we always get one Vim person at least. Always a Vim. All right, I should have expected that. All right, so as an advocate, one of the things I do is I come to these conferences and I interact with y'all either in person or on our social media channels, and I try to meet y'all where you are. I try to hear what languages y'all are doing. I try to see what use cases y'all are doing, and I bring that back to the product group and say, hey, there's this really big need for, whatever feature. Can we try to make that happen? Can we push that along in our iteration plans? So there's really that two-way feedback cycle where we push out features to y'all and we want to broadcast them and talk about them in things like these conference talks. But at the same time, we also want to hear from y'all, and I bring that feedback back to the engineers and say, hey, this is a big thing that just kept coming up. Let's try to figure that out. Okay. So that's enough about me. Let's actually dive into why y'all are here today. So how many of y'all use containers? Okay, so actually that's more than we usually get. Cool. So for those of you who might not, I'm going to do a really quick overview of what containers are. You can see on this screen, I have two pictures. They're both containers. And the reason for that is when I was like, okay, containers is a big buzzword. I should probably figure out what the heck a container is. It helped me a lot to think about what a physical shipping container is in the real world, right? Because that's kind of where containers got their name. So in a super simplified supply chain example, all that physical shipping containers do is they let goods stay together in one package. So let's say, I'm working at like some sort of manufacturing plant or something, and I am going to load up a shipping container to a company, and let's say it's a shipment of furniture. So I'm just going to load all their furniture up, put it in that container, it's going to ship over to the company. Cool, they got it all in one piece. Next day, I need to send something else to that company. I'm just going to, let's say it's clothing. I ship over, load it up with a bunch of clothing, ship it over to the company. They got it, great. Thing is, it doesn't matter what was in that container. It got shipped the same way. It was a streamlined way to get those products in one unit to the company. And that's really what a container is in technology as well. So continuing with that analogy, all that containers are in the virtual world is a streamlined way to ship products. In this case, your product is your application. So they allow your software to stay together as one unit. That's going to include all your binaries, your dependencies, and your configuration files. And this is going to reduce time spent on configuration overhead because everything that the software needs to be ran is in that container. It doesn't need to go reach out to a bunch of other places and try to find that in order to get the application to run. It's all good, self-contained in that one package. So if we take a look at this diagram on the right here, we can just kind of see a very basic overview of what containers are. So you can see that they're going to sit on top of the operating system. So they're going to be cross-platform, right? You can sit them on top of Windows, on top of Mac. Doesn't matter, they're going to work because, again, that container has everything that the application needs. You don't have to go anywhere else for it. It makes it very modular and easy to move from environment to environment. Okay, Docker. Obviously, we need to talk about this because it's in my session title, but this is going to be a very short slide that I spend time on because, like I said, this isn't a Docker presentation, but we will be using it in the demo. So just a really quick overview of what Docker is. It's one of the most popular container runtimes. It is cross-platform, so again, Mac, Windows, Linux, whatever you want to do. We're not going to go into the details of Docker implementation because this is going to go over how to use all the cool things of Docker, but then we don't have to deal with the implementation of it. It's basically just something that we have installed and then we forget about it. Okay, so we've talked about containers. Now let's go into something called dev containers. And it's pretty self-explanatory. It's the words development and containers mashed together, dev containers. So they are the same exact concept of a normal container, though. When containers first came out, they were traditionally used only at the production phase of the software lifecycle. So you deal your coding, cool, everything's good, everyone's dealing with their own environments, and they're like, okay, we got a deployment, let's go ahead and package this all up, get it nice and pretty, put a bow on it, ship it off to production. Cool, all good, because then you know, again, production has everything it needs for that application to be ran. Production's gonna be good, you're solid. But it'd be way better if we could use those benefits throughout the entire development process. So from the very start of developing and testing your code, that you're working in a dev container. And what this is going to mean is if we take a look at this diagram, whatever application you're running on, your dev container will have all the runtime, the libraries, and the dependencies that it needs to run. So you no longer have to worry about inconsistent environments. It's going to be consistent with other environments like production, for example, but also like your coworkers. So you're not going to be having all these issues with trying to figure out debugging issues in different environments and trying to hunt down the source of a problem. You're not going to have that headache because everyone is developing in the exact same environment with the exact same configuration. All right, so went over the what of dev containers, and now let's talk about the why of dev containers. I touched on it a little bit kind of towards the end there of what dev containers can do for you. But this is kind of a visual representation of a few of the use case scenarios that we have. So over here on the left, classic meme, this is fine. That is a visual representation of how I've ever felt onboarding onto literally any project ever in my life, right? You join, the dev lead's like, oh, hey, welcome. Here's the repo. Go ahead and download that. Get it running. And you're like, cool, I'm going to be so good. I'm about to code like everything. And then you run it and literally nothing runs at all. And then you're like, hey, dev lead, I tried for like 3 hours and I can't figure it out. Is there just like a really quick command I'm missing? They're like, oh yeah, just run this. And then you do that and then, cool, your first error is gone. Now you got another one. And they're like, oh, go reach out to this other person who's no longer on the team, but I know that they had that issue too. And there might be some documentation that's like 5 years old and super outdated. So why don't you spend the next week going over that? Right? Like it makes me worked up because I've been through this on every project I've ever been on. It's so annoying. So dev containers completely take that out because they get rid of that manual setup. They get rid of that configuration. You can just start developing, day one, your dev lead says, hey, here's the repo. You pull that repo down, you spin it up in a dev container, and it's got everything you need. And it just works. And you can actually start being productive in your first week, which is like mind-blowing, right? Okay, so that's the first scenario. Second scenario is similar, but it's more often kind of something you say when you've already been on a project for a little while. I've said this a lot. Classic scenario of you're excited, you're working on code, push it up, it all worked on your local machine, you tested it, and then either your coworker pulls it down or your build fails and the pipeline's broken and suddenly you have like 20 pings at like 6 p.m. at night and you're like, oh, no, I'm out. You just say, oh, I mean, it worked on my machine, so I don't really know what your problem is. Well, you can't really say that because if it doesn't, just because it works on your machine, that doesn't work because there's probably a good chance it's going to fail in production at some point or it's going to fail somewhere else. And you're going to spend all this time trying to figure out why on earth it did. You have to figure out, okay, well, I have Windows, they have Mac, maybe it's something with that. Oh, well, they just upgraded this, maybe it's that, right? You spend all this time that's completely unnecessary trying to figure out an issue when your code was fine, it just doesn't work on other people's machines. So again, the dev containers give you that consistent environment. So the dev container I'm working in is the same dev container my coworker is working on, and it's going to be the same dev container that production ends up going in. So you don't have to worry about those inconsistencies and spend all that time trying to figure it out. And then this one on the right, sorry, I didn't have a good meme for that, but it's just a representation of how it's really popular to use dev containers in education as well too. If y'all have maybe ever led a workshop, for example, you know that like a lot of times the first 30 minutes are just dedicated to getting your environment set up. Or you wrote a tutorial and the first 3 pages are, okay, yeah, go here and download this and do this and run this command. Make sure you have this extension. And then those 30 minutes go by. You've wasted 30 minutes trying to get this up. Everyone's like, yeah, I'm in a good place, we're set. And then 30 minutes later, someone's build breaks because nobody reads instructions or listens. So of course, everyone's thing is actually broken now. So it's really popular to use dev containers in education as well because same thing that I mentioned before, if you just have a repo that has a tutorial, you can stick a dev container in it, they can spin it up, and they'll be off to go. All right, so we've gone over the what, the why, and now the how. So what I'm going to be showing you today is a combination of VS Code with Docker and the remote containers extension in VS Code and the devcontainer.json file, which helps configure the entire dev container. So any questions before I move into the demo? Good? Okay. All right, so for today's demo, you get to choose your own adventure. I have 3 very simple Hello World apps, but you can choose Node.js, Python, or .NET Core. Whoa, okay. That was unexpected, okay. Let's do Python. I'm gonna be honest, that's the one I practiced the least because I didn't think that y'all were gonna want that, but let's do it. Okay, let me open up VS Code. Okay, so what we're gonna go through is just, again, a very simple Python app that I have, and we're gonna add a dev container to it and see how that works. So I'm going to open my folder and try to remember where I put this. All right, y'all said Python, so Python it is. We're gonna select that folder. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at this app. It's incredibly simple. We're basically just serving up this HTML file, which says VS Code can do that. Yes, it can. So just really easy. There's not even CSS, super simple. I'm going to take a look at the extensions I have installed though. So if y'all are VS Code users, you know that the extensions are the power of VS Code, right? If you don't have certain extensions installed, then you are not going to be able to run and debug your code usually. Your IntelliSense is going to be all wonky. It's basically at that point truly just a text editor. It's not the full IDE that VS Code can be. So let's look at the extensions I have. All I have is Dracula because that's the theme I used. And I didn't want to get rid of that for this demo, sorry. And the remote containers extension. That's literally all I have installed. So if you're a Python user, you know that I'm about to have some issues because that's just not really how it works. But if we go over, oops, the opposite of what I wanted. The remote containers extension. This takes like literally 2 seconds to install. You can just search it. It's a Microsoft extension. But what it's going to do is let you use a Docker container as your full development environment. So now that I have that installed, I also have Docker desktop installed, so you can just see, I'm not lying to you, it's on my desktop down there. And we're ready to go to see what dev containers can do. So first, let's just, for kicks and giggles, go ahead and try to run this. So I'm gonna go to the Run and Debug tab. Can you all see this? Sorry, I should probably increase that. It's a lot smaller up here then. Okay. All right, now that y'all can actually see that, I'm going to go to the Run and Debug, and I am going to start running it. Oops. Can't run it. It basically says, the debug type doesn't work. Do you want me to install the Python extension? Yes, but I'm going to have you install it in the dev container because that's the point of this whole demo. So let's see what dev containers can do for this. I'm going to hit F1, which opens your command palette. You can see this is my recently used. You would just type in remote containers, and that's going to give you all your remote container commands that come along with that remote containers extension. And I'm going to add a development container configuration file. So you see it took like just 2 seconds to kind of load for a second there. That's because it's looking at my current code base, and it's saying, what kind of files do you have here? So you can see in the dropdown, it's showing me Python. Usually this is pretty good, but if for whatever reason you want to do something else, you can go to show all definitions. And this is going to show you everything you can do with dev containers. These are specifically the container configuration files that we currently have loaded in with the remote containers extension. I'm sure there will be more added, but you can see there's a ton. There's, you do Docker, Kubernetes, Azure, there's like every language, C++, Go, so many different things. I'm not going to scroll through all of them. Java. So these are just all examples of things you can do. And depending on whatever code base you have, you can just go ahead and do this and pick the default configuration file and then customize it to your own. But this is Python. So let's go ahead and do Python. Which I'm going to do, I think I need to do Python. I'm doing 3, sorry. And then we're not going to do a Node.js. Okay. So you can also have additional features to install, things like Azure, AWS, other things you can hook into it. Again, this is a super simple app, so I will not be doing that. Okay. Let's see what we got here. So as soon as I did that, you can see a couple things happen. One, I got this pop-up that says, hey, this contains a dev configuration file. Do you want to reopen a container? I do, but I'm going to go over this real quick before I do that. So now in our File Explorer, we have this new .dev container folder that it automatically created for us. Within that, we have the dev container JSON file, and then also a Docker file. It automatically generates that. This is what I was talking about where I said, y'all don't need to know what's going on with Docker to do this because you don't need to generate any Docker things. VS Code's going to do it for you. So I'll just really quickly scroll through this Docker file just so you can see what it looks like. It's not really particularly interesting. It's just downloading an image from the Microsoft Container Registry, so you know it's coming from a legit place, and then just adding any versions. This is something that you can add commands to. This is what actually builds your Docker image, so whatever certain commands you need for this, you can edit this. I'm not going to do that for the purposes though, because I don't want to deal with Docker. So the other file I added, which is what we're going to be focusing on mainly in this presentation, is this devcontainer.json file. And if we scroll through this a little bit, we'll see, okay, we got a Python 3. The Docker file it's going to use is this Docker file. Didn't use any node. And then it automatically set up some of these customizations. So Python needs a little more extensions than some of the other languages to really get it to the state that you want it to be in. So by default, it puts in all these different linting and sets different settings there for your path. So that way it's going to go ahead and set. And then the extensions that it needs, it automatically puts in a couple of the Python ones that you're going to need. So again, this is just a default configuration. We're going to deal with it a little bit more, and you can customize it with a ton of different properties. But let's just see what it does out of the box. So I am going to hit F1 again, and I'm going to do remote containers reopen in container. So what that's going to tell VS Code is, hey, the folder that you have open right now, it's got a dev container in it. Go ahead and open this up in the dev container. If we take a look at the log, you can see it's running a bunch of basically Docker commands right now. It's building that image automatically just by me saying, hey, reopen in dev container. It's going to read that Docker file, and then it's also going to read the customizations in that dev container.json to customize my environment. So it takes just a few seconds for this to go through. But once it does, we'll have those extensions and those settings set, as well as our Python 3 up and running. Okay, so you can already see it's pretty much almost done there. On the bottom, we're still activating extensions. Is VS Code still running on Windows though? Yes, yeah, so we're still, that's the cool thing about this. We are still just all on, VS Code's on my laptop, right? I didn't move at all. That's the beauty of this whole thing, is your development experience does not change at all. There's like 2 little visual indicators that I'm about to go over that happen when you're in the dev container, but otherwise it feels exactly like your normal VS Code development experience. All right, so I think we're good. Looks like we got some of these extensions installed. It has all those set up. So let's take a look at some of those visual indicators that I was just talking about. So first of all, the file explorer is completely unchanged, right? There's no like extra files added unless in your configuration or in your build file you said to copy any files over or anything. But for this, it's simple, nothing new there. In the bottom left here, we can see this now says dev container Python 3. If you hover over it, it says editing on dev container. Sorry, I know it looks pretty small for you guys, but in the bottom left, it's just says dev container on it. I can't really make that any bigger. Yeah, I'll try one more. Okay, so that's there. If we also look at the terminal, okay, let's go one tick down again. If you look at the terminal, actually, I'm going to, it looks a little different too, right? So it's kind of a slightly different coloring, and that's because you're now on your dev container. So now if you type anything like trying to get your versions, it's going to tell you what the versions installed on your dev container are. It's not going to tell you what's on Windows because that's not the environment you're in. You are, yes, still developing. Your VS Code is still on Windows, but you're within a container on there. So all the dependencies you have are now located in that container. And then one other thing I want to show, if y'all remember checking out my extensions before, let's make this a little bigger again. So locally, I still have my Dracula and my remote containers installed. That's still there. But take a look at what I now have installed in my dev container. We now have all these cool Python ones that automatically got installed with kind of those Python extension packs. So these are not on my local VS Code. They are just my dev container. As soon as I close out this remote connection, I'm going to be back to just my normal VS Code with just Dracula and remote containers. So this is really cool for if you don't like having like 10,000 extensions installed. you can just have all these different dev containers with your different environments, and when you spin those up, it's going to have the necessary extensions. So if you don't like all the bloat of having all these extensions, dev containers are a great way to kind of solve that. Okay, so I'm going to hide that. Actually, no, we're going to go back to that. Let me arrange this a little better. So again, the idea of this is I'll spin this up in a dev container, and it's now going to run. Let's see if that's true. So before we got that error where we didn't have a certain extension. Let's do this now. Okay, still erroring actually. I have no module named Flask. I promise this is supposed to happen. So I always get a little nervous. I'm like, man, it's really hard having a demo where it's like supposed to break. It's like my heart goes. Okay, so it says no module named Flask. So I forgot that we actually have a requirements.txt, which is going to set up our Flask dependencies. So this is pretty common if you're familiar with Python, and you usually run the pip3 install-r requirements.txt command. So I can go ahead and do that on the terminal, and it will run because I now have everything installed. But that's not the point of dev containers. The point of dev containers is I should be able to spin it up, and it works right away. So we're going to make one change to our dev container, and VS Code actually makes that super easy. So I'm in the dev container.json now. And if we scroll on down, since this is such a common thing for Python users, they actually have this in the default dev container JSON, but it's just commented out. So you just have to make sure that you uncomment that if you do have a requirements.txt file. So now what's going to happen is when I reopen this dev container, it's going to automatically run that command. So it's just this post create command. You can do this in the Node project, for example. Yarn install is a very common one that you do for this, so that way it just automatically builds your Node modules and everything. So let me go ahead and do that remote containers, rebuild container, so we can see what happens there. So quick note, if you do make any changes to your dev container.json, it's not going to take effect until you rebuild that container, because you have to basically rebuild those configurations. But it is, let me go ahead and show that log. It is pretty quick to do, right? So this is handy to see that you can really easily just add different commands, add different dependencies, because when you're developing code, there's going to be new updates. There's going to be updates that break other things. You're going to have to update your dependencies. All you have to do is update that JSON file, rebuild it in the container, and you're going to be all good. Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know. Probably. I want to say yes, but I'll double check with you. Okay. So what we just saw here, I'll scroll up to the top. Running the post create command from devcontainer.json. That's what we just did. So you can see that it's automatically running that post create command, which installs that requirements.txt dependencies. And it does that. So now I don't have to go ahead and run that. So now that that's done, let's try this again, and it should work. If we run that, there we go. Okay. So that's up, and it's going to say you want to open in the browser, and yes, I do. Again, it's just a super simple thing. But once this loads, we just have that. VS Code can do that. It sure can. So again, thank you. Nice. So yeah, so you can see how easy that can be. Obviously, this is a very simplified example, and y'all's code bases are way more complicated than this. But these are just some examples of what you can do to get up and running. And you can see it's really good for demos too, because I didn't have to stress out about making sure that my environment was absolutely perfect before this happened. I tried to make sure my dev container was correct, and then it was fine. So just one other quick thing I want to show in this repo specifically. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so like I said before, this is exactly the same as your normal development experience now. So I can just make changes. And type, and just, it's exactly the same, oops, as I'm used to. I can make those changes. I can just run and debug it again. I can just develop like I normally do. And it's the exact same experience as what I'm used to in VS Code. There's no difference. It's just that initial open this folder in the container, and then that's it. There's nothing else you have to do. It's the same thing. So we can just see that, re-debug that, and we will see that it says, yay, code on the beach, right? So really just trying to drive home the fact that it's the same exact experience to you once you have that in the dev container. And one other thing I'm going to show is, again, how easy it is to switch to a different environment. So we just built this nice Python environment, which is cool, but the reason I was able to come prepared with 3 different languages is because of these dev containers. It's super easy for me to move. So I'm going to open, oh, okay. I'm not going to open now because I'm going to close my remote connection, which I always forget to do. So I'm going to close that remote connection, which basically says, get me out of this dev container. I want to just go back locally. Yeah.
Okay, you just closed out the program, then click close the remote connection. What happens?
Well, yeah, this is kind of buggy. It's the reason I try not to do this. So usually what happens, because if you have the default VS Code experience where it just reopens what was last open, a lot of time what happens is it then just tries to spin and spin and get to your connection and just spins and spins and spins, and then you just have to end up closing it again. Otherwise, there's not really an issue, because you can just go, you can always look in Docker desktop and look at your containers and just close it out there. It's not really an issue because, again, it's just local. It's not like you're really eating up that many resources. But you would just either, you might have a kind of annoying experience when you open VS Code again right after that. Yeah, good question. All right, so I'm going to open a folder that I have that already has a dev container in it. So I'm going to do this node one and open that up and just show how easy this is. So again, this is just one of the other really easy, quick hello world applications, and you can see right away I get this reopen in container. So that's because I have this dev container folder and the dev container JSON. So I'm going to reopen this because now I want to work with Node. So I'm going to reopen that real quickly, and it's going to load, and we can see how easy it is to move from one framework to another without me having to install anything else. All I'm doing is opening these repos that I've already cloned, and then that's it. And as that goes, so one thing I didn't quite touch on with the previous one, I mentioned all I had to do was clone these repos, and then there's a dev container in it, that's it. So that very first Python example that I had where we added the dev container to it, all I would have to do is check in that devcontainer.json folder, or the .dev container folder with the Docker file and the devcontainer.json files, into the, push it into my repo, and then anyone else can pull that, and then they'll have access to that too, and then they can just reopen it in the dev container. So you can just have like one person on your team set this up once, and then everyone else can just chill back and be like, let me know when the dev container's ready. Pull it down, and then you're all set. All right, so yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Have you played around with the actual requirements.txt to see if you can specify in there? Because that's what I would think would be the first thing, is if you can actually specify it. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, so this won't really bypass anything like that. You're going to see the same experience as what you would see when you're normally just running that pip install and your requirements.txt. It's not doing anything else. It's literally just saying, okay, now run this. It's basically automating what you do as a human. So it's not going to be doing any sort of trickery in the back end to kind of bypass anything like that. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I want to say yes. I believe so. Is there another question back here? Yeah.
What happens if you update a container in the middle of it? You're working on Python 3.9,
Mm-hmm.
you decide, you know what, screw them, I'm going to upgrade to Python 3.10.
Uh-huh.
I'm still working on Python 3.9, my container running. I pulled down your code, not realizing that he updated the container.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you say you're switching to like Python 3.10, do you mean locally you're switching to it, or?
Like meeting or parent.
Yeah.
You're working on 3.9.
Uh-huh.
I'm working on 3.9. You say, screw you, Brian, I'm
Oh, right.
3.10.
Yeah.
You upgraded 3.10. I pulled down your code and don't realize that you upgraded to 3.10.
Right, yeah. So at that point, if you reopen in the dev, it's going to be whatever the dev container says. So if all of a sudden I said, hey, I'm going to mess with these requirements, and I change that to Python 3.10, now whoever then pulls that down and reopens in the dev container is going to have Python 3.10. But it's going to be specifically in that dev container.
Every time I pull down, I'm going to have to close my dev container.
You don't have to, no, you don't have to close it down. Well, okay, first of all, these dev container JSONs don't change that frequently, right? It's usually you try to make sure you kind of have the environment down. Generally, you're not changing from Python 3.7 to 3.8 to 3.9 to 3.10, like every single day. You kind of are saying, okay, we're using this framework, and then you might be changing again, in a couple months or something. At that point, it's saying, oh, hey, we are upgrading this framework. Make sure you're rebuilding the container and that you have that. So it's really just a communication thing at that point. But if you do decide just willy-nilly you want to change your frameworks and dependencies like twice every single day, then while you're in your dev container, if you haven't pulled that code, you're happy in your little dev container. But yes, as soon as you pull down that new dev container and rebuild it, you now are going to be having those new dependencies in the dev container. Yeah. Can you say that again? There is in the works. Yes. We'll touch a little bit on that at the end. Okay, any other questions while I'm here? Okay, so really for this, I was just showing you can pull it up, and I'm just now going to launch this program really quickly. And we will see that I didn't have to do anything else once it loads. We'll open that in the browser, and we've got hello remote world. All right, so that's the end of kind of the dev container specific demo. We have one more demo with code spaces, so I'm going to go ahead and transition over to that. The dev containers and the code spaces, they sure do. That's a great segue, thank you. All right, let me see what we got here. All right. Okay, so that was pretty cool, right? Being able to just pull up your dev container within VS Code. But let's take it one step further to the cloud, because everything's going to the cloud these days, so why not? Hop on the train. So if we take a look at this diagram, this green, doesn't look as green on the projector, but it's this nice light lime green square that has the container. That's what we just worked in, right? We just worked in that dev container. The concept of taking the dev containers to the cloud, Microsoft made that entry with GitHub code spaces. So I'm gonna do a demo of that, but basically all it is it takes that dev container and it puts on a VM that's hosted in the cloud. And the idea with code spaces is that then you can just interact with that code space with your VS Code editor, whether that's on the desktop or in the browser. So really it's the best of both worlds, because you can get those dev containers, but then you also get the other compute. It is in the cloud though, so it's not free, so depends on what your worlds are. So your question about do these integrate well? They do. They integrate really well. It's super easy to move from what we just did to code spaces, because it uses that exact same dev container.json. So once you have this set up in your remote containers extension locally, if you have that dev container.json in your repo, you can run code spaces if your organization has it enabled. So it's a super seamless transition into the cloud, because once you're just doing it in the dev container scenario that we just went through, then you're all set. All right, so let us take a look at what that looks like. Okay, so I'm going to show a couple different things. I'm also going to change. We're going to do the node one. So what I'm going to demo is going to be basically the code I just showed when we switched over to Node. I'm going to show that in the code spaces, so that way you can see exactly what it looks like for the dev container. This is the same repo, just with the dev container already checked in. It's just forked from a Microsoft one. So let me up that tick a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to show two things though, because, well, first of all, how many of y'all have seen or heard of GitHub code spaces? Okay, a few people, cool. A lot of times when people look at GitHub code spaces demos, they get confused with something that we have called github.dev. So I'm going to show you github.dev first, and then show you how it's different from GitHub code spaces. So I have this repo on GitHub, and anyone who has a repo on GitHub can do what I'm about to do. All I'm about to do is hit the period key, and it's going to open VS Code in the web. All I did was hit the period, that's it. And it's going to go ahead and open VS Code in the web there. Super easy, super free. Anyone with a GitHub repo can do this. So that's,
Does that work on private repos?
yeah. Yeah, just do it. Dot. I'm pretty sure it works on ADO also. I think we unleashed that a little while ago. Yeah, super cool. I know, it's like my favorite thing to show. Technically this isn't dev containers, but I was like, I have to show it. Okay. So let me show you why this is different than code spaces though. This is a full editor now, right? I can go in and I can make changes and I can save them and I can check them in if I want, and I can even make PRs. I can do whatever I want here, except when I go to run and debug, it says, oh, you can't run and debug. And that's because this really is just kind of the editor part. It's not that full-fledged run and debug. You really need to be in desktop for that. So that's the downside of github.dev. You can't really test out your changes, but if you're just kind of making really quick, like README changes, something like that you don't need to test at that moment, or you're, just something that, maybe you're working locally and you're like, oh, I can test this later once I have compute, then that's good. But like a lot of people will do this, like, I think you can even do this on your watch maybe. Like I've seen like that, and it's like your Apple Watch. I don't recommend it, but I think I've seen that. So it's really cool to have that portable experience and have VS Code in the web. So I am going to go back to that repo, and I'm going to go ahead and show code spaces. So again, this is something that has to be enabled in your organization, and you can go ahead and create a code space there. So I already have one created. I'm just going to go ahead into that, and it's going to set up. It takes just a few seconds to set up. What it's doing now is spinning up my dev container on that Azure VM. So this is going to look just like what we saw with github.dev with that VS Code in the web, but it's going to now have a VM backing behind it. So it's not going to be using my local compute anymore like it did in my first demo. It's now going to be using the Azure compute. And I'm going to use it in the web just because I want to, but right before this, you could see there is a open this in VS Code Desktop. You just have a different extension, so you don't have to do it in the web if you don't want to. All right, so this, again, just looks exactly like what we just saw in github.dev, except now when we go to run and debug, we can actually run and debug it. So it's a really great way to be able to have that compute behind if you want to be coding on the go. In general, sometimes your laptops are really slow. Sometimes it takes a lot of processing. So GitHub code spaces are really great for kind of those things that need more power, for things that you don't want to use your local compute for. And it's a really seamless transition because I didn't push anything else up to that repo. I just had that dev container folder, and it read from that and spun that code space up from that dev container. I didn't have to do anything else. It's truly a seamless transition. Once you check it on in GitHub, you can put that code space in, and boom, you've got that dev container. And it looks just like how I normally code with VS Code, except it's now got a VM behind it, right? No difference to the user experience. Yeah. No. Yeah, sorry. The question was, can you self-host this? And the answer was no. So yeah, this is, again, only available for, I think it's the team and enterprise organizations, and those organizations have to have it enabled. So you'll know pretty quickly if you're part of an organization if you have it, because you'll go to code and you'll either see create code space or you won't. But the cool thing is you can always just hit that dot and do VS Code in the web from there. And then just always use your desktop to run and debug. All right, so let's switch on back over to one of our final slides. Okay, so I just spent a lot of time going over dev containers, how cool they are, and how VS Code can help you use them. So this slide is about where we want to go next. And ironically, it's that we want it just not to just be for VS Code. We want it to ideally be really easy to create and configure dev containers with that dev container JSON file in whatever environment you are in. So a couple of steps that we're starting to take with that is we did release the open specification and the dev container.cl or the dev container CLI. You can go to containers.dev to kind of read up about that. What the idea behind that is, a couple of steps we're taking is we are going to try to use it with continuous integration, so it's really easy to reuse your dev container.json files in your pipeline. So we have an ADO task and a GitHub action. If you go to that link, it ends up linking you to those repos with it. So you can start to use those in your pipeline. And ideally, we also want to have this in places that aren't VS Code. So our first step with that is one of the public issues that we're tracking is trying to get Gitpod involved with it. If y'all aren't familiar with Gitpod, they literally specialize in this entire thing. They're just a platform to really easily spin up development environments. They were also created because they were annoyed with setting up dev environments. So we're working with them to basically see if there's a way that they can do like what the remote containers extension does, where they can just take that dev container.json, read those configurations, and spin up the environment. So again, this is very early stages. There's not really anything super tangible happening right now, just things in the talks. But it's definitely where we want to go because this is a cool thing, and we want everyone to be able to experience it no matter where they are. All right, so quick wrap up. Dev containers can drastically reduce overhead time spent on things like setting up projects, resolving dependencies, and onboarding other developers. And the best part of it is with VS Code, you never have to leave the home of your IDE, right? The whole time, it just felt like a normal development experience. But I was getting to leverage all these cool dependencies. I was getting to leverage the cloud, do all these cool things, while it still felt like my normal dev experience. So with that, thank you very much. Feel free to connect with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. That ak.ms link is just a quick learn module with dev containers if you want to try them out. I think that one uses Python as well. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions now too. Thank you.